I loved him in ink because my voice was too scared. By the time he knew it was me, graduation was already waiting. I sat next to him every day, close enough to hear the scratch of his pen, close enough to notice when he sighed during difficult questions, and yet far enough that he never knew how loudly my heart reacted to his presence. He was just the boy in the next desk to everyone else, but to me he was familiarity, comfort, and curiosity wrapped into one quiet routine. We never talked much beyond borrowed pens, shared glances, and polite smiles, but somehow that felt safer than words. I was the kind of girl who rehearsed conversations in her head and then stayed silent when the moment arrived, afraid that my voice would betray everything I felt. So instead of speaking, I wrote. It started with a sentence scribbled on a torn page folded too many times and hid it inside his textbook when he wasn't looking. Good luck on the test today. No name, just ink. I watched him find it later, confusion flickering across his face as he looked around the room, searching for answers I could not give. My chest tightened and warmed at the same time because, for the first time, something I felt had reached him, even if he did not know it came from me. After that, I could not stop. I wrote encouragement before exams, jokes about teachers' lines from songs he hummed under his breath, and every note felt like a conversation I was too afraid to start. He kept them. I noticed because he stopped throwing papers away carelessly and started checking his book slowly, carefully, as if expecting something. Sometimes he smiled while reading, and I would look down, pretending not to notice, pretending that smile was not meant for me. The notes became my voice, the only way I knew how to be honest without being exposed. I wrote things I would never say out loud, how his presence made long days easier, how sitting next to him felt like enough, how I hoped he was happy, even when I wasn't brave. He never asked me directly if it was me, and I was grateful for that because denial felt safer than confession. Weeks passed and the classroom started changing. Posters came down, desks felt temporary, and graduation whispers floated through the halls. The closer the end came, the heavier my pen felt. I wondered if anonymous love counted, if words mattered, when they had no face, if he would ever care who wrote them. Sometimes I imagined telling him everything, watching recognition bloom on his face, but the moment never felt right, and fear always spoke louder than hope. I told myself there was still time. I did not realize how quickly time disappears when you are waiting for courage. Writing to him slowly became the safest part of my day because paper never interrupted, never questioned, never looked back at me with expectations I was not ready to meet. I learned the rhythm of his routine when he opened his bag, when he left his book, unattended, when the classroom buzzed just enough for me to slip another folded truth into his world. Each note felt like a small risk and a quiet victory, my hands shaking slightly as I placed it there, my heart racing long after I returned to my seat beside him, pretending nothing had happened. I watched him more closely after that, noticing how he reacted to the notes, how he searched his books with care, how his eyes softened before he hid the paper away like it mattered. Sometimes he would glance around the room, lingering on faces longer than usual, and every time his eyes passed over me, I held my breath, afraid he would see something written on my face that I could not erase. The notes grew longer as my courage stayed small, and I poured into them everything I was afraid to say, how I admired the way he helped others quietly, how he laughed at his own mistakes, how sitting next to him made ordinary days feel lighter. I never wrote anything too obvious, never crossed the line between affection and confession because anonymity felt fragile like glass, and I was terrified of breaking it. He started mentioning the notes casually to friends, joking about having a secret admirer, and every time I heard the words, my stomach twisted with a mix of pride and fear. I wondered what he imagined when he thought of her, whether she was confident, outspoken, someone nothing like me, or exactly like the version of myself that only existed in ink. Sometimes he would read a note twice, fold it carefully, and tuck it back into his book, and those moments stayed with me longer than they should have because they felt like shared silence. I told myself that knowing he read them was enough, that knowing he smiled was enough, that I did not need credit for something that already made me feel seen in a way words never had. But as days passed and graduation crept closer, the notes started to feel heavier, like borrowed time, like conversations paused mid-sentence. I began to wonder if I was protecting my heart or delaying a goodbye that would hurt more later. Every note ended without a name, and every blank space where my name should have been felt louder than any confession. I thought about stopping, but the thought of him opening his book and finding nothing felt worse than the fear of being known. So I kept writing, loving him quietly, hoping that maybe one day the ink would be brave enough for both of us. Have you ever hidden behind anonymity to protect your feelings? It was the way he started checking his books first thing in the morning that made me realize something had changed, because before he used to open them carelessly like nothing waited inside. Now he flipped pages slowly, almost respectfully, as if the paper itself mattered, and every time he did, my heart reacted before my mind could catch up. One day he laughed softly while reading a note and said, out loud, "Whoever you are, you make my days better," and I froze, pretending to tie my shoelace because I did not trust my face to stay calm. Hearing my words reflected back through his voice felt unreal, like my thoughts had briefly stepped into daylight without me. He started asking around, joking with friends about having a secret admirer, and each time someone guessed a name, my stomach tightened with a strange mix of jealousy and relief. I watched girls smile at him differently after that, watched possibilities form that had nothing to do with me, and I wondered if anonymity was protecting me or pushing me further away. The notes began to feel riskier, not because I feared rejection, but because I feared being replaced by an idea that was braver than I was. I wrote less playful things than more honest ones about fear, about timing, about how some people speak best on paper, and hope someone reads between the lines. He read those notes more quietly, and sometimes he did not smile at all, which scared me more than indifference ever could. I wanted to explain myself, to tell him that the girl he was looking for was closer than he thought, that she sat beside him every day pretending not to care. But courage does not arrive just because you ask for it, and mine stayed stubbornly quiet. Graduation announcements filled the hallways, countdowns appeared on classroom boards, and suddenly the future felt loud and fast. I realized that soon there would be no desks, no textbooks, No quiet moments to slip words into his life unnoticed. The notes started to sound like goodbyes even when I did not mean them to, and every sentence felt heavier, knowing it might be one of the last. One afternoon, he turned to me holding a folded paper and asked casually, "Do you think it's weird someone keeps leaving me notes?" And my heart stopped. I shrugged, said it sounded kind of nice, and hated how small my voice felt saying it. He nodded thoughtfully and said he wished he knew who it was because he would like to say thank you properly. That thank you stayed with me all day, louder than any confession I'd ever written. For the first time, I wondered if silence was no longer kind, if it had crossed into cowardice. I sat beside him that day, closer than ever, and felt the distance between us grow heavier with every unsaid word. I still wrote another note that night because stopping felt like losing him completely. But for the first time, I signed nothing and felt everything. Should I have told him when he started searching? After that conversation, the air between us felt heavier, like every shared silence carried words I refused to release, and every glance lasted just long enough to make my heart stumble. I noticed the way he looked at me more often now. Not suspicious, not curious, just thoughtful, like a question he did not know how to ask. Every time our arms brushed as we reached for the same book, my body reacted before my mind could calm it, and I wondered if he felt it too, or if that was another story I was telling myself. The notes became harder to write because everything I wanted to say seemed to demand a name at the end, and I was still not brave enough to give it. I wrote about endings, about how some things are precious because they are temporary, about how timing can be cruel even when feelings are kind. He read those notes slower than the others, folding them carefully like they might break, and I watched him carry them in his bag instead of his book. One afternoon, he asked me if I believed people missed chances because they were scared, or because they were meant to, and I knew he was talking about us even if he did not know it. I said, sometimes fear feels safer than regret. And the moment the words left my mouth, I wanted to take them back. Graduation rehearsals began, and our desks felt smaller, like they were already preparing to let us go. I caught myself memorizing details, the way his handwriting leaned, the way he tapped his pen, when thinking the sound of his laugh when something surprised him. I wondered how many of those details he would remember about me if he ever knew. The idea of telling him grew louder every day, but so did the fear of changing everything right before the end. I was afraid that if I spoke, and he did not feel the same, the notes would lose their meaning, and our quiet closeness would disappear overnight. I told myself that loving him quietly was better than risking losing him entirely, even if that meant losing myself a little too. But silence began to feel less like protection and more like a wall I had built too high to climb. I realized that almost saying something can hurt more than saying nothing at all. One evening, I wrote the shortest note I had ever written, just one sentence folded tightly. If I told you who I was, would it change anything? I stared at it for a long time before placing it inside his book, my hands shaking more than usual because this time the risk felt real. All day I watched him waiting for him to find it, waiting for the moment everything might shift. When he finally read it, he did not smile, he just looked thoughtful, then closed the book slowly. And in that pause, I felt the weight of everything I almost said pressing harder than ever before. The days after that note moved faster than I expected, like the world had decided not to wait for my courage anymore. He became quieter, thoughtful in a way that made me wonder how many of my words he was carrying with him and what questions they had started asking inside his head. Sometimes he would glance at me as if he wanted to say something and then look away, and those moments felt heavier than any conversation we never had. Graduation announcements grew louder, caps and gowns appeared in classrooms, and suddenly everything felt temporary, including us. I realized that soon there would be no shared desks, no textbooks, no excuses to sit beside him every day pretending that was enough. The notes started feeling like borrowed time, like pages being torn from a story that was about to end. I wanted to stop writing because every note felt like a goodbye, but stopping felt like erasing proof that I had ever loved him at all. I wrote about endings, about how some connections exist only in certain places at certain times, and how letting go can be its own kind of love. He read those notes slowly sometimes, unfolding them more than once, and I noticed how carefully he kept them now, like something fragile. One afternoon, he asked me if I was excited for graduation, and I said yes, even though excitement was not what I felt. I felt fear and regret, and a growing ache for something I had never allowed to begin. He said he would miss this class, miss the routine, miss the small things, and for a moment I thought he was talking about me. I almost told him then, almost let everything spill out because the end was so close, and the risk felt smaller than the regret. But the bell rang, cutting the moment in half, and I stayed silent again because silence had become a habit I did not know how to break. That night, I wrote the longest note I had ever written, pouring everything into it. Gratitude, honesty, affection, the kind of truth that only comes when you believe there might be no tomorrow. I folded it carefully, knowing it might be the last, and placed it inside his book the next morning, my heart racing like I'd already lost something. All day I watched him waiting for a reaction, waiting for clarity, waiting for courage to arrive too late. When he finally read it, he looked around the room, not urgently, not playfully, but like someone searching for something important. Our eyes met, and for a moment I thought he knew. But then he looked away, and the day ended like every other day except heavier. I walked home that afternoon knowing time was no longer on my side. And for the first time, I wondered if loving him quietly would leave me with nothing but words no one could answer. Have you ever waited until it was almost too late? The closer graduation came, the harder it became to pretend that everything was normal because normal no longer fit the weight of what I was carrying. Every sound in the classroom felt louder, pages turning, chairs moving, laughter rising and falling, and through it all, I felt like I was counting moments instead of days. He started coming in earlier than usual, sitting down, opening his book slowly, like he expected something to be there, and every time my chest tightened before he even reached the pages. One morning, he pulled out a note, and instead of reading it immediately, he turned toward me and asked quietly, "Do you think it could be someone in this class?" My heart beat so loudly I was afraid he could hear it, and I shrugged, pretending to think, while every part of me screamed the truth. He said, "Whoever it is knows me really well, knows things I never talk about, and for a second I forgot how to breathe because those words were meant for me even if he did not know it yet. He smiled softly and said, "It feels like they sit close to me, like they see me every day." And I looked down at my hands because if I looked at him, I would give myself away. That was the moment he was closest to finding me, not because of the notes, but because of how honestly he spoke about them. I realized then that anonymity had not protected me. It had only delayed a truth that was already alive between us. Later that day, I saw him holding the stack of notes I'd written, folded unevenly, edges worn from being opened too many times, and something inside me broke gently. He cared more than I had allowed myself to believe, and that knowledge made my silence feel heavier than ever. I wanted to tell him everything right then, to stop hiding behind paper, to let my voice shake if it needed to, but the fear of changing everything at the very end still held me still. I thought about how fragile moments are, how easily they pass, and how often we mistake hesitation for safety. That afternoon, I did not write a new note for the first time in weeks, and the absence felt louder than any words I'd ever written. When he opened his book and found nothing, I saw the flicker of disappointment cross his face, and it hurt more than rejection ever could. I realized then that my silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice with consequences. Walking home that day, I understood something painfully clear, that love does not wait forever, even when it is gentle, even when it is kind. Graduation was no longer a distant idea. It was standing right in front of us, counting down the days, and I was running out of places to hide my truth. Was this the moment I should have confessed? I thought courage would arrive like a wave, sudden, unstoppable, loud enough to drown fear, but when it finally came, it was quiet, hesitant, and already late. Graduation week changed everything. Hallways filled with excitement, teachers smiled differently, desks were rearranged, and the classroom that once felt permanent began to loosen its grip on us. He looked different too, not in the way he dressed or spoke, but in the way he seemed to pause more often, like he was aware that moments were slipping through his fingers. I felt it every time I sat beside him, knowing there would be only a few more times left, and that knowledge made my chest ache in a way ink could no longer carry. The notes had stopped completely, and the silence between us felt strange, like a conversation cut off mid-sentence. One day he turned to me and asked softly, "Why do you think the notes stopped?" And my heart shattered a little because he sounded disappointed, not relieved. I said maybe they were never meant to last and immediately hated how small and distant my answer sounded. He nodded slowly and said he hoped whoever wrote them knew how much they mattered, and in that moment, every word I had ever written pressed against my throat, begging to be spoken. I wanted to tell him it was me, that I had been there the whole time, loving him quietly, hoping he would feel it, even if he never saw me. But fear has a strange way of convincing you that silence is safer even when the cost is unbearable. Graduation rehearsal came, and we sat alphabetically, not together, and the distance between our seats felt larger than the room itself. I watched him laugh with friends, take pictures, plan celebrations, and I realized how easily life keeps moving, even when your heart is stuck in one moment. After rehearsal, he walked beside me for a few steps longer than usual and said he would miss this class, miss the routine, miss sitting here, and I wondered if he meant me too. I almost stopped him, almost said his name the way I had only ever written it, but the word stayed trapped behind fear. That night, I wrote one last note, my hands shaking more than ever, and for the first time, I signed it with nothing but a question mark. "You were never alone." I placed it in his book, knowing it would be the last piece of myself I could hide there. The next morning, he found it and looked around the room slowly, his eyes searching every face, and when they passed over mine, I felt exposed and invisible at the same time. He did not say anything, just folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Graduation came and went. Too quickly, caps were thrown, hugs were exchanged, and just like that, the desks were empty. I walked away carrying a love I never spoke, and courage that arrived only after it no longer had a place to land. Have you ever found courage only after the moment passed? Time moved on because it always does, even when your heart begs it to wait. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and the story I never finished slowly became something I carried instead of something I lived. College was louder, faster, filled with new faces and new routines, but none of them knew the version of me that sat in that classroom, writing love in secret ink. I told myself it was over, that some stories exist only to teach you how deeply you can feel, and then leave you with the ache as proof. Then one evening, my phone buzzed with a notification I almost ignored. It was a message request from his name. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My hands went cold. My mind raced, and every moment we shared flashed through me at once like the universe pressing rewind. I stared at the screen, terrified of what it might say, and even more terrified of what it might mean. Finally, I opened it. "I don't know if this is strange," it read, "but I've been thinking about something for a long time." My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if it could be heard through the phone. He wrote that he still had the last note, that he kept all of them actually tucked inside a notebook he never used because it felt wrong to write over words that once saved him. He said the notes had changed him, made him braver, kinder, more honest with himself, and that he never thanked the person who wrote them. Then came the line that made my breath catch. "I think I know who it was." I reread it again and again, my chest tight with fear and hope, tangled so tightly I couldn't tell them apart. He said he noticed the way I always knew what to say, the way my eyes followed him when he laughed, the way my handwriting once matched the way a word was written on the board. He said he didn't know why it took him so long to see it, but now that he had, he couldn't unsee it. He ended the message with a question that felt heavier than any note I'd ever written. "Was it you?" I stared at the screen for a long time, knowing that with one word my entire past could change. This time courage didn't arrive quietly. It demanded an answer. I typed back slowly, my fingers trembling. "Yes." The message showed, seen almost instantly. Then nothing. Seconds passed, then minutes, and each one felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to find out if you would fall or fly. Just when I thought I had imagined the whole thing, my phone buzzed again. "Can we talk?" For the first time since graduation, my heart didn't ache. It waited. Should she have admitted the truth? We decided to talk that same night because waiting any longer felt like lying to ourselves again. The call rang once, twice, and then I heard his voice. And suddenly I was 17 again, sitting in that classroom pretending my heart wasn't racing every time he turned around. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Silence stretched thick and fragile like glass that might shatter if either of us breathed too hard. Then he laughed softly, not the loud, careless laugh I remembered, but something quieter, more real. "So it was you," he said. I swallowed and nodded, even though he couldn't see me. My voice came out small but steady. It was always me. He told me how confused he had been back then, how the notes felt like someone understood him in a way no one else ever had. He said he used to reread them before exams, before games, before days when he felt invisible. I confessed how scared I had been, how writing felt safer than speaking, how I believed if he knew it was me, everything would break. He paused, then said something that stayed with me. "Nothing would have broken," he said. "I just didn't know how to listen yet." We talked for hours about school, about college, about how growing up feels like slowly realizing everyone else is just as unsure as you are. Then the question I had been waiting for finally came. "Why didn't you ever sign them?" I took a deep breath and told him the truth. Because loving him felt too important to risk. Because I thought silence was kinder than rejection. Because I believed some feelings were meant to be carried, not shared. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush me. He just listened like every word mattered. When I finished, he said something that made my chest ache in a different way. "I wish you had trusted me," he said gently. "But I understand why you didn't." I expected regret, maybe sadness, maybe an apology for timing that never aligned. Instead, he surprised me. "I don't think it's too late," he said. My heart skipped. "For what?" "For honesty," he replied. "For seeing what this could be without hiding." He admitted he had liked me back then, more than he ever said that he noticed my quiet presence long before the notes, but never thought someone like me could feel that way about someone like him. We both laughed at that, realizing how fear had written stories for us that weren't true. Before the call ended, he asked if we could meet in person soon, not to rewrite the past, but to see if the future still had room for us. I agreed, before doubt could speak. After the call ended, I sat in the dark, smiling like someone who had finally finished a sentence they started years ago. For the first time, my story didn't feel unfinished. It felt paused right before something new. Do you believe timing can change everything? We met on a quiet afternoon at a cafe near our old school, the kind of place where time feels slower, like it knows some moments deserve space to breathe. And when I saw him walk in taller, calmer, carrying years on his shoulders instead of noise, I realized we were not trying to go back. We were meeting for the first time as who we had become. He smiled when he saw me, not surprised, not searching, just sure, and that steadiness made my hands stop shaking. We talked easily about work, dreams, disappointments, the strange way life pulls people apart, then gently places them back in front of each other when they are finally ready to look. And I noticed how he listened. Now really listened, like every word mattered. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was mine. At one point, he reached into his bag and pulled out something worn and folded. One of the notes. I laughed and covered my face because seeing my own handwriting from years ago felt like meeting a younger version of myself who didn't know yet. That fear is loud, but regret is louder. "I kept them all," he said quietly. That was when I understood that nothing I had felt back then was wasted. Not the waiting, not the silence, not the ache. I told him something I had never said before. "I didn't write those notes hoping you would love me," I said. "I wrote them because loving you made me brave in ways I didn't understand yet." He reached across the table, not rushing, not forcing, just offering his hand. And when I placed mine in his, it felt simple. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just right. We didn't promise forever. We didn't rush into labels. We didn't try to make the past mean more than it needed to. We promised honesty to speak, instead of hide, to ask instead of assume, to sign our names on the things that mattered. When we walked out of the cafe, the sky was soft with evening light. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about what might be lost. I was thinking about what could be built. I used to believe loving quietly was safer. Now I know loving honestly is stronger. The girl who hid words in textbooks grew into a woman who finally learned to say them out loud. And this time, I didn't leave the page. Blank, I signed my name. Do you think some love stories need time to mature?